Good evening. I'm Kelly Geer Ripken, National Chair of A Women's Journey. On behalf of Johns Hopkins Medicine's A Women's Journey, thank you for joining me this evening for our monthly webcast series, Healthy Conversations That Matter. A Woman's Journey strives to improve your well-being through health education. Did you know, according to the Parkinson's Foundation, a new study estimates that nearly 90,000 people in the U.S. are diagnosed with Parkinson's disease each year? This represents a steep increase from the previous estimate of 60,000 diagnoses per year. Tonight, we are joined by Johns Hopkins neurologist Liana Rosenthal, who will speak about Parkinson's disease. So please use the Q&A on your screen to ask your questions to Dr. Rosenthal, who will respond during the last 20 minutes or so of our program. Tonight's webcast will conclude at 8 p.m. And I want to take this opportunity to acknowledge and thank Johns Hopkins University's program Hopkins at Home for their production assistance. You can visit their website, hopkinsathome.jhu.edu, for additional lectures and courses throughout the year. A Woman's Journey acknowledges the support of the Wiglicki Family Foundation, sponsor of Healthy Conversations That Matter. And now I am pleased to welcome Dr. Rosenthal. Dr. Rosenthal?
Well, thank you. Great. Thank you so much for the introduction. And it is my pleasure to be here today to talk with all of you about this rise in Parkinson's diagnosis. So before we launch in to talk about why there is this increase in Parkinson's diagnosis, I wanted to start off so we're all on the same page about what is Parkinson's disease. So Parkinson's disease, and you probably know someone with Parkinson's disease, or certainly know a famous person who has Parkinson's disease. It is chronic, so it's ongoing. It is neurodegenerative. In other words, it gets worse over time. And it's characterized by a tremor when someone's hand is at rest. Rigidity is sort of a stiffness to their movements, a slowness of movement, and then also balance changes due to Parkinson's disease and not from other causes. And that's a key point because there are a lot of causes of balance problems out there. And specifically when we think about Parkinson's disease related balance problems, we want changes due only to Parkinson's and not from other causes. If there's someone in your life with Parkinson's disease, you probably know that the symptoms involve so much more than what is just listed here. But nevertheless, these are the core motor symptoms, the core movement symptoms of the disease. And all of these core movement symptoms are caused by a loss of dopamine in the brain. Dopamine is a chemical in your brain that kind of allows for a lot of that get up and go feeling. And so with that loss of dopamine in the brain, it causes all of these symptoms that I'm talking about. And part of the reason, and maybe the reason of this loss of dopamine, is an accumulation of a protein called alpha-synuclein. And I'll be talking more about alpha-synuclein over the course of the talk today. But alpha-synuclein is considered to be the bad protein in Parkinson's disease. So with that in mind now, and this is a briefest of all backgrounds in Parkinson's disease, I'm going to go through over the next 40 minutes or so a brief history of Parkinson's disease. I'm going to talk about the spread of alpha-synuclein, that bad protein that I talked about. I'm going to talk about genetic factors and aging factors that lead to the diagnosis of Parkinson's disease. And I'm going to talk also then a lot of time about the environmental factors. And then finally, I'm going to put it all together to really hopefully explain the reasons for, or at least some of the reasons for this increase in Parkinson's disease diagnosis. And then finally, I'm going to wrap up with a little bit of what can you do? How can we help ourselves? How can we decrease the number of people who are developing Parkinson's disease? And if you already have Parkinson's disease, what can you do to help your symptoms and your disease right now? As an aside, I also want to thank two of my colleagues, Dr. Ray Dorsey and Dr. Kelly Mills, for their assistance with some of the slides and putting this together. So first, I'm going to give you a very brief history of Parkinson's disease diagnosis. Parkinson's disease has actually been described for a very, very long time. So these are two examples from Eastern medicine. So around 600 BCE, Susrata's book, Susrata Samhita, which apparently, as I understand it, is kind of the underpinning of the Ayurvedic medicine, sort of Indian medicine. And he described in his book a slowness, a disease with a slowness that is consistent with Parkinson's disease. That's the red book there on the screen. And then around 420 to 220 BCE, the Chinese medical book, The Yellow Emperor's Classic of Internal Medicine, described a tremor and stiffness resulting from what they describe as a yin-yang imbalance. And for those of you who are familiar with Chinese medicine, a lot of their philosophy stems back to this concepts of yin and yang and the balance between those two. And these photos here are from Amazon. You can buy translated versions of both of these books on Amazon, and that's where I got the photos. So you can see Parkinson's has actually been described for a very long time. Moving over then to Western medicine, in the 1600s, Sylvius de Laboe, who was a Dutch physician scientist, described Parkinson's-like symptoms. And then in 1817, James Parkinson, he was a British physician, he finally published his essay on the shaking palsy. It was 6 patients, and he described the motor symptoms of Parkinson's disease. He got it mostly right. He didn't talk about the cognitive problems that people see in Parkinson's disease, and he did also talk about some of the depression and anxiety that we see in Parkinson's disease. But with his 6 patients in 1817, he got it mostly right. However, the disease itself wasn't actually called Parkinson's disease until around 1872, when Jean-Martin Charcot, a French neurologist, suggested that we call the disease Parkinson's disease. So in other words, Parkinson's disease has been around for a very long time. But this still begs the question then, why are more and more people getting diagnosed now than they were back then? And just to put some numbers on this is from the Global Burden of Disease study. And I'm going to kind of talk you through this slide a little bit here. So you can see the number over here on up and down. So this is 200,000 people, 400,000 people, going up to 1.2 million people up here. And in 1990, a little more than 400,000 people globally were diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. And the colors are based on age. So if you're over amongst the group here of, I guess, I guess 80,000 or so were over age 80. And then this orange group were 75 to 79. And you can see it's more common in older adults. But the overall number was 400,000, a little more than 400,000. By the time you get to 2019, though, this same global burden of disease study is noting more than 1 million individuals worldwide with Parkinson's disease. And you can see that it's really grown in every age category. So we can't attribute it to one particular age. The blue block is a little bit bigger, the orange block is bigger, the gray block is bigger, yellow block. Every age has gotten a larger and larger diagnosis of Parkinson's disease between 1990 and 2019. So with that background, I'm going to take one step back a little bit, and I want to talk about a little bit more about the spread of alpha-synuclein, because this is going to then become more meaningful as we then talk about these genetic and environmental factors. So first, again, alpha-synuclein is considered the bad protein in Parkinson's disease. And what happens is the alpha-synuclein protein gloms up and gathers all together and becomes kind of a blob. And when it becomes a blob, it basically blocks the neuron from working. And this is a picture of this blob in the middle of the neuron. If you think of it as like a big traffic jam on the Beltway, if you have all of these cars all there, nobody can get by in any direction. The Beltway stops working for a little while. And in many ways, the alpha-synuclein operates the same way. It kind of all aggregates up, and the neuron can't work as well for a while. And what we've learned and what has been shown over time is that this bad protein, this alpha-synuclein protein, actually travels from neuron to neuron. And so originally, there were a husband-wife duo, Brock and Brock, back in 2004. What they noticed in about 60 autopsies, so not that many, what they noticed is that there seemed to be this alpha-synuclein that starts here in the lower part of the brainstem and then works its way up and then works its way up to what we call the midbrain right here. And here in the midbrain is when the alpha-synuclein is there. That's when people actually start to develop symptoms. And then the alpha-synuclein continues all the way into the cortex, and it keeps going. And so the idea is the alpha-synuclein travels up, and we think it travels up from the gut, and then it goes all the way up into the spinal cord, into the brainstem, and into the cortex. The upper part of the brain is the cortex, the bit of the upper part there. And so this was the hypothesis for many years. And more we are seeing that there's probably actually two different entry points for alpha-synuclein. So there are these two patterns of deposition. So I want you to kind of ignore the numbers a little bit, but if you just say like 100% is the max amount of alpha-synuclein, and you don't need to know the names of the brain parts down here, but rather just point out this is the spinal cord, this is the brainstem area, and this is the cortex area. And then over here, same thing, spinal cord, brainstem, cortex. And the idea is that there seems to be these two patterns. And what they did is they looked at 124 patients on autopsy, so a larger number. And they noticed these two patterns, these two differences in concentration. So in one of them, they noticed that it starts in the spinal cord and works its way to the cortex. So there's less in the cortex than in the spinal cord, and the concentration goes down. And the reason there'd be less in the cortex, in the upper part of the brain, is it takes longer to get there. So you're starting in the gut and you're working your way up. You're going to have a lot more in the lower parts of the brain and then less and less as you go up. But then they also noticed this other idea. And in this idea, they noticed that there seemed to be a peak in the part of the brain that when you smell and you breathe in, those neurons go right back to that part of the brain. So there seemed to be other people that had this peak right where the nose enters into the brain, and then less alpha-synuclein going down toward the spinal cord, and less alpha-synuclein going down towards the cortex. In other words, maybe in this group, it seems to be starting in the nose part of first, and in this group, it seems to be starting in the gut part first. And so now we're going to take these concepts of, yes, there's an increased risk of Parkinson's diagnosis. More and more people are being diagnosed, despite the fact that it's been described for centuries. And there are these two different entry points, and alpha-synuclein is the bad protein. We're going to take those concepts and we're going to apply them moving forward. So what causes this bad alpha-synuclein in the first place? That's the first question. And so to think about that, we're going to think about genetic factors and aging factors. And in terms of genetic factors, there are a long list of genetic factors. So again, let me orient you to this here. You can have genetic factors that are low risk, medium risk, high risk, or very high risk. And then in terms of how frequent these genetic factors are, they can be very rare, intermediate, or really common. So you can see up here, you have a whole bunch of genes that are very high risk, but very, very rare. And down here, you have a whole bunch of genes that are low risk, but very, very common. And a whole bunch of time and energy has been spent looking at these genetic factors. The theory being, if we can identify the genes that increase the risk of Parkinson's disease, we can understand why this alpha-synuclein gloms up, why the alpha-synuclein does that in the first place. And if we can understand that, then maybe we can develop therapies that will stop the alpha-synuclein from doing that. And we can even then develop therapies that target very specific genes. And we are doing exactly that. There are actually an ongoing trial looking specifically at this LRRK2 gene, and another ongoing trial looking at things related to this GBA gene. But the hope is, if you look at all of Parkinson's disease, all of these genetic risk factors, actually only about 15 to 20% of patients seem to be testing positive for all of these genetic risk factors, which means about 80% of people don't have a genetic risk. Now, it could be there are genes that we haven't identified yet. So maybe this percentage is going to go higher. But still, if you look at genetic and heritability overall, the overall heritability of Parkinson's disease is very low. So this is a chart here that lists a whole bunch of diseases, as you can see, and how heritable they are. Like, how often do you get this disease because you got it from someone in your family and there's some genes there? So you can see something like type 1 diabetes is incredibly heritable. If you have the gene, you have the disease. If you have a family member with it, it's likely came from a genetic source. So that's type 1 diabetes. And then if you look down here, you can see that breast cancer, which certainly has a lot of interest in genetic factors and a lot of tests for genetic factors, breast cancer heritability is actually comparatively low. And so let me show you, Parkinson's is not that much higher than breast cancer, and even Alzheimer's has a much higher heritability factor. So while there are these genes that lead to Parkinson's disease and that increase risk of developing Parkinson's disease, the overall heritability is actually not that high compared to other diseases. So that's one element of the diagnosis. We know that the genes are absolutely important in terms of developing Parkinson's, but there's more to the story. We also know that longevity is a factor. And so the older you are, the greater your risk of developing Parkinson's disease. And so what this is showing is if you look at the age range across the bottom here, and if you look at what we call the incident rate, the number of people per 100,000 that have the disease. If you look here, people in their 20s, effectively no one. I'm sure there are some people out there who get it in their 20s, but for the purpose of the, per 100,000 risk here, it's very, very low. But by the time people are in their 80s, amongst women, it's, 125 per 100,000. And amongst men, you get up to around 300 per 100,000. So longevity is very clearly a factor in the rise of Parkinson's disease. And as people live longer, there is going to be an increased risk of developing Parkinson's, for sure. That is part of it. So there's the genetics part. There's the people are living longer part, so more people are going to develop Parkinson's disease. But what I'm going to talk with you today about is there's probably more to it than just the genes and people living longer. And so I'm going to show you this slide here. And what this is looking at is that the overall prevalence of Parkinson's disease is actually highest in the industrial world. So what the colors, the reds and the oranges are a greater prevalence. The blues and the dark blues are a lower prevalence. And so if you look here at the industrialized countries, you can see it's actually a really high rate of Parkinson's disease. And so the yellows are like somewhere in between, basically. And so, if you look, a lot of Europe is yellow. You can see the US and Canada are very, very high. Africa is comparatively lower. Australia is kind of somewhere in the middle. So you can see overall the prevalence of Parkinson's seems to be highest in more industrial countries. So this then leads to the discussion of the environmental factors. So I'm going to talk in few detail about general pesticides and then specific pesticides. So in terms of general pesticides, what we're looking at here is they followed 184,190 people for 9 years. And they looked at the number of people exposed to these certain things, like X-rays and radioactive materials, and then the number of cases. And then they applied something called relative risk. What you need to know is if it's on this side of relative risk, it's bad. It means this exposure was bad. If it's on this side of relative risk, that means the exposure is good. And if it crosses the midline, that means for the purpose of Parkinson's disease, the exposure is neutral. So you can see here, X-rays and radioactive material for the purpose of Parkinson's disease didn't increase risk at all. But if you look at pesticides and herbicides, you can see that exposure of pesticides to herbicides significantly increase the risk of developing Parkinson's disease. And to put slightly different numbers on it, those exposed to pesticides and herbicides 10 plus years before the start of study had a 70% higher incidence of PD 10 to 20 years later. But what's important is that farmers who were not exposed to pesticides had no increased risk. And so this can be followed then in other studies as well. In one study, it showed that PD risk was 90% higher in people exposed to insecticides and herbicides. And then this is a map of Central Valley, California, and you can look here at exposure and the farmland. And essentially, there was a 2.5-fold increase in Parkinson's disease in counties that had greater than 30% acres sprayed. So that's kind of what you're looking at here on the red map. And there's this large increase in Parkinson's disease for people who are living in these counties that have more insecticides and herbicides. So that's sort of globally looking at pesticides. But now we're going to talk a little bit about paraquat in particular. And paraquat actually seems to lead to 150% increased Parkinson's disease risk. If you look at this, the estimated use of paraquat on U.S. agricultural land, if you look at a great story in The Guardian, you can see how much paraquat's use has increased since, I believe, since 1999. It shows in the Guardian article, and you can watch a little like animated video that where basically these red areas that are looking at greater than 3% pounds per square mile are getting more and more over the course of 1999 to 2018. And basically, paraquat increased the risk of PD again by 150%. What's also sort of interesting is if you go back and read this Guardian article again, it talks about how the company that makes paraquat knew all along that it likely was causing and could cause Parkinson's disease. Nevertheless, paraquat continues to be used, and it continues to be used on farmland because it's a really great for killing the insects that want to kill our crops. And so it continues to be used. Another pesticide I want to talk about, another chemical exposure, I should say, really, is something called trichloroethylene, or TCE. This actually leads to a 500% increased risk of Parkinson's disease. And so what I have here are the occupations with possible TCE exposure, commercial and consumer uses, and industry uses. And you can see here, it's a long list of occupations. So it's, dry cleaners is one in particular, painters, metal treatment workers, electronic manufacturers, computer specialists. And then there's a whole bunch of commercial and consumer uses as well. Adhesives, carpet cleaners, decaffeinated coffee, refrigerants, stain removers, wood finishes. And then in industry, there's a large list as well. And the thing about TCE in particular is that actually what it will do is it will pollute the groundwater and the indoor air. So what you're looking at here is you see on site it's released, it goes into the soil, it contaminates the groundwater. It then, by contaminating the water, it goes into the homes. It also becomes a vapor that goes into the homes as well, and it will pollute groundwater and indoor air. I didn't include it here, but you can actually find significant increases in TCE if you live, for the people living above a dry cleaner in New York City. So they looked at dry cleaners in New York City, they looked at the apartments above them, and there was a significant increase in TCE. Also there's a military base, a marine military base that has significant TCE pollution. And that has shown a significant increase in the rate of Parkinson's disease, as well as rare cancers. This actually led then, just last week, for the Biden-Harris administration to ban the use of TCE and its cousin, perchloroethylene. And it basically bans it in all consumer uses and many commercial uses and requires worker protection for all remaining uses under the Toxic Substances Control Act. So this is actually great news in terms of Parkinson's prevention, and also, frankly, great news in terms of prevention of a whole bunch of other diseases. So what it said in its press release, I'll read the first paragraph, is that TCE is an extremely toxic chemical known to cause liver cancer, kidney cancer, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and it also causes damage to the central nervous system, i.e. Parkinson's disease. And then, of course, also liver, kidneys, immune system, reproductive organs, and fetal heart defects. These risks can be present even at small concentrations, and with today's rule, all uses of TCE will be banned over time, with the vast majority of identified risks eliminated within 1 year, and safer alternatives are readily available for the majority of uses. So this is great news, and then certainly PCE is sort of TCE's cousin, and it has also been banned. So this is great news in terms of reducing our risk of developing Parkinson's disease as a population, as well as, of course, reducing our risk of developing these other cancers and other things as well. It's important to note, though, that even with the ban of TCE, there are still other pesticides and other chemicals that can cause problems and be part of this increased risk of Parkinson's disease. And one of them exactly is air pollution. So traffic air pollution increased PD risk in Denmark, and traffic air pollution increases PD risk in Taiwan. So it actually increases PD risk in both of those places as well. So in other words, there are a whole large range of environmental exposures. And I've also talked briefly about a whole wide range of genetic exposures. So the question is then, how can we put this all together? So like anything, the story gets more complicated. Not everyone exposed to pesticides gets Parkinson's disease. And so what probably is happening, like many diseases, is that we have our environmental exposures, and then we have our genetic risk, and together, it increases the risk of Parkinson's disease. So I'm going to give you now a couple of specific examples where we have determined that this is exactly what seems to be happening. So, for example, another example from California, the fungicide Manab and the herbicide paraquat exposure. And they took people who were exposed to Manab and paraquat, and then they sequenced the gene for something called antioxidants. And what they found is that people who had a bad gene variant who were exposed to Manab or paraquat had a higher risk of Parkinson's disease. And people who had the bad NRF2 gene variant and were exposed to Manab or paraquat had a faster progression rate of Parkinson's disease. And this is compared to people who didn't have these bad variants of the gene. And up until now, as far as we know, there was no variance in our genes are normal. So we know that there are these variants, and we all have gene variations, and we know we have genetic variations because we all look a little different. And so it is normal to have genetic variants. And so the reason these are bad is they're only bad in the context of exposure to Manab or paraquat. So in the context of exposure to these fungicides or herbicides, these gene variants become bad or good. As another example, we can look at organophosphates pesticides. So these are things, I list them here, malathion, parathion, and others as well. And then what they did is they looked at exposure to these organophosphates. And again, they looked at something called the PON1 gene that metabolizes organophosphates. So people who happen to have a gene variant that led them to be a fast metabolizer had no increased risk with the organophosphate exposure. But people who happen to have a gene variant that were slow metabolizers did have an increased risk with this organophosphate exposure. And we know that this idea of fast and slow metabolizers and good and bad genetic variants applies across a whole bunch of medication spectrums, across a couple of other disease spectrums, and these things are only good or bad in specific contexts. So I'm going to put it together then for you another way. We've talked about how genes plus environmental exposures increase Parkinson's disease risk. So I'm going to put this together all as one. Essentially, exposure interacts with genes to trigger the start of Parkinson's disease. So you start off with your genetic background because, that's how you're born and those are the genes. In some cases, then, you are going to inhale some environmental exposures. So these may be things like air pollutants, for example. These could be the toxic fumes from TCE, for example. So you're going to breathe them in through your nose, and that may lead to kind of this nose first version of the alpha-synuclein that I showed you about earlier. Alternatively, you may end up eating some of these things. So you could eat some of these pesticides instead. Either way, these environmental exposures mix with your genetic background to then over time have you develop these early changes associated with Parkinson's, and then the tremor, and then ultimately the Parkinson's disease diagnosis. And this is one way of putting it together. I'm going to put it together for you again on the next slide because some people learn differently. So with that in mind, this idea, we have these environmental toxicants in the middle. Some people are eating them. So you have TCE, you have PCE, things like that. Sometimes you're eating them. And this bad alpha-synuclein starts in your gut and works its way up your spinal cord to your heart a little bit, and then it keeps going up to your brain and then into your upper part of your brain. Other people inhale these, probably mixed with genetics. And in that case, the largest concentration of this alpha-synuclein is in this part of the brain and then spreads to the other parts from there. So there's sort of the body gut first and the brain first. And these environmental exposures can actually explain both models of alpha-synuclein. So now that I suspect I have thoroughly scared you of looking at all of these environmental toxicants, and you're starting to, think about washing and scrubbing all of your vegetables and fruits before you eat them, and making sure that, you never dry clean again, I want to talk a little bit about how much exposure and what does that really mean? And the bottom line is we haven't really done studies on this. But it's probably clear for most of us who are not spraying pesticides. So I'm not standing there with paraquat spraying it on crops myself, right? I'm not that level of exposure. I'm going to give you an example of weight and eating. So let's say you weigh 190 pounds and your goal for the holiday season is simply to not gain weight. And you decide you're at a holiday party and you decide to eat one cookie. We all kind of know that one cookie is not going to cause you to gain any weight. So similarly, when my kids were little, I would walk around the grocery store and sometimes I just needed something for them to eat. And we would sometimes not wash off the fruit and we would just sit there in the grocery store and eat it because they just had to eat something to get through the hour in the grocery store. So a little exposure, and one cookie, you're not going to gain any weight. But let's say you eat plate after plate after plate of cookie at the holiday parties that you're going to this week. And if you eat all of those plates of cookies, you may end up gaining a little bit of weight. So similarly, I can't tell you because we don't know how much exposure is safe. We don't really know the answer to that. We know that if you live above a dry cleaning building, that is probably too much exposure. If you really want to get your dress or your suit dry cleaned one time and then you wear it, you're probably going to be fine. One cookie, you're probably going to be fine. Plates and plates and plates of cookies, probably not. And the other thing I want to talk about then is, so a little bit of exposure probably isn't terrible, but we don't know the numbers. I also want to point out, and here's a really important thing, we as a society can do better. And so I'm going to give you an example here. This is in the Netherlands. Pesticides between 68 and 86 significantly decreased. Trichloroethylene significantly decreased, and air pollution significantly decreased between the 90s and 2000s. And between 1990 and 2011 in the Netherlands, there was a 60% decrease in the incidence of Parkinson's disease. So in other words, this decreased environmental exposures decreases Parkinson's disease. So these are things that we as a society can actually do something about. We can decrease the number of people diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. These are actionable items. So since I've spent a fair amount of time talking about things that we can't do, you can't change your genetics. You can't change if you grew up on a farm. You can't change if you need to work in a factory. These are things that you can't change. What can you do? So with that in mind, talk with your congressperson. Make sure the TCE ban stays. Encourage a ban on paraquat. If you live near a Superfund site, Superfund sites are locations with polluted hazardous material, kind of where they store them. Encourage your congressperson to try to clean it up. Talk with them about it. And then look into sources of air pollution. Encourage legislation around reducing these air pollution sources because it worked in the Netherlands. And if it worked in the Netherlands, it can work here too. And that's globally. And really, it requires global policy to reduce a global need. And at the very least, it requires US policy to reduce US problems here in the US. But what can you do locally, absent of, politics? Avoid dry cleaning your clothes. Now, with the ban of TCE and PCE, we need to look into what chemicals we're going to be using next. But certainly this dry cleaning your clothes, that may not be true. Maybe at least for the next year, avoid dry cleaning your clothes. If you must, let them air out outside, not in your car, outside, before wearing them or bringing them in your house. If you let them air out in your car, all of the chemicals will just be in your car when you sit down in your car. So don't do that. Roll up your windows in heavy traffic. Use air filters if you live in urban areas. Wash your fruits and vegetables before eating. And there's been a whole bunch of information lately on NPR and the New York Times about avoiding heating black plastic. And I can't show you data directly that black plastic and the chemicals of black plastic relate to Parkinson's disease, but generally chemical exposure is probably not good for you. So that's what you can try to do both globally and locally to reduce these bad things that are causing Parkinson's disease. But the good news is there are actually some protective factors as well. So there are things that you can do to reduce bad exposures, and there are things that you can do to protect yourself. Now, the very first thing that you can do to protect yourself, I actually don't recommend, because smoking is actually lower in people with Parkinson's disease. But none of us, there's not a physician out there who would ever suggest you start smoking to lower your risk of Parkinson's disease. And the thought is that maybe this is something called reverse causality, and that people with Parkinson's disease are actually less likely to be addicted. Smoking is considered a protective factor, but don't do it. That in mind. There are other protective factors that people do like, and higher caffeine consumption actually also lowers your risk of Parkinson's. So when you have your morning coffee, you can claim it's because you are lowering your risk of Parkinson's disease. People usually like that one. The one that people like a little bit less tends actually to be physical activity. So they looked at more than 48,000 men and more than 77,000 women. And what they found is that higher physical activity actually lowered your risk of Parkinson's disease by 30%. Strenuous activity in early life is actually a 60% lower risk in men. In women, though, interestingly, higher physical activity was not associated with PD risk, but strenuous activity in early adulthood was a 50% reduction. I can't speak to the gender differences, but the bottom line is exercise and activity seems to be protective across genders in a slightly different pattern. So that's all fine and good in terms of protecting yourself. But what if you already have Parkinson's disease? Now what? And so what we talk a lot about if you already have Parkinson's disease is this concept of disease modification. So here's the idea. Over time, and this is your PD progression, everyone starts out right here. And over time, your Parkinson's is getting worse and worse. But if you do something that modifies the disease, you change the slope of that line. So at, the halfway point, instead of being right here, you're actually all the way out here in terms of your symptoms. So you're doing better. So it's called disease modification. So there are things you can do that actually help now if you already have Parkinson's disease to slow that risk of the Parkinson's disease getting worse and worse. Adjust the slope of that line. So importantly, a better diet quality actually leads to less death from Parkinson's disease. So what do we mean by good and bad? Good, vegetables, fruits, whole grains, nuts, omega-3 fatty acids. Bad, all the things that we already know about. Things like trans fats, sodium, sugar-sweetened beverages, fruit juices, moderate alcohol. Those are things that are considered bad. Again, though, going back to the cookie example, if you have one cookie and you have Parkinson's disease, you are not going to increase your mortality over one cookie. So you keep that in mind in terms of diet. And specifically in terms of diet, they looked at the Mediterranean diet, and what they found is that adherence to Mediterranean diet actually reduced death in Parkinson's disease. So these are things like more whole grains, more nuts and legumes, and less red or processed meat. And if you're more interested in the Mediterranean diet, you can look it up in all of its detail. So that's also something you can do to reduce your risk to reduce your progression, if you have Parkinson's disease. And then one of the best disease modifiers is actually exercise. And I always like this slide because it basically says here, my doctor told me to start my exercise program very gradually. Today, I drove past a store that sells sweatpants. So the idea and the hope is that you start your exercise program a little bit faster than this. But it's important to note that physical activity results in less death from Parkinson's disease. Most active people with PD are 30% less likely to die than the least active people. And the question always comes up when I talk about exercise is what exercise should people do? And almost the idea is basically anything is better than nothing. Tai Chi for balance, bike riding for gait, pool walking for endurance, essentially something that you will enjoy that you'll do almost every day, at least 30 to 45 minutes. Balance, gait training, cardiovascular endurance. Something is always better than nothing. But if you really want to drill down into the weeds, you can actually point out, and there have been studies that have shown that more intense exercise may be even better than less intense exercise. So what this is looking at is something called the UPDRS motor score. This is a standard scale that we use to rate people's symptoms with Parkinson's disease. And if after 6 months it's 0, that means no change, that means over 6 months, your Parkinson's disease didn't change at all. And what they found is that people who exercised to 80 to 85% of their maximum heart rate over 6 months had no change in their Parkinson's disease. People who exercised to 60 to 65% had about 1 or 2 point worse in their Parkinson's disease. And people who had usual care, who weren't really exercising, those folks were about 3 points worse in their Parkinson's disease. And so the idea is that people who are exercising and exercising more intensely are actually slowing the disease change in Parkinson's disease. The other thing you can do if you have Parkinson's disease is take the medication. And we all see these ads on TV. And of course, the pill they advertise all the time on TV. I'm not sure what it is, but I want it. Because sometimes they make those medications look very, very good, right? And so this is basically showing that a medication called levodopa and many other medications also help symptoms. So again, this is this change in how this score. 0 means no change at all. If you're down here, that means your Parkinson's symptoms are better. If you're up here, that means your Parkinson's symptoms are worse. So people on placebo, a sugar pill, their symptoms got worse over time. And people on medication, their symptoms got better because they were on the medication and then slowly got worse. And I just want to put this slide up here to really show you that there are many medications that we can use to try to improve symptoms of Parkinson's disease, with the idea that if someone does develop Parkinson's disease, there are definitely things that we can do to help. So to summarize today's talk, Parkinson's disease has been around for a very long time. There are genetics that clearly cause Parkinson's disease, but environmental causes are more likely responsible for the recent increase, along with a little bit of longevity thrown in there. But really importantly, there are things you can do to decrease your risk and or slow your disease progression. So with that in mind, I will show you a picture of my dog who was hard at work, and I'm happy to take any questions.
That's great. Thank you, Dr. Rosenthal. That's so cute. Wow, wonderful presentation, lots and lots of information. So we're going to jump right into the questions. Let's start with this very basic one. Dopamine, right? Okay, so how is there a way to keep it or get it back as you start to lose it? As you said, it starts with that. So is there a way, any little special trick, anything you can eat or sleep or anything?
Other than these things I talked about in terms of exercise and healthy eating and taking good care of yourself, nothing that we know of specifically to stop that dopamine from going away. No, not at all, as far as we know.
No magic,
No
little
magic.
trick.
No, I mean, there's,
Okay,
try not to have these environmental exposures, but I mean, there aren't things if you live on a farm, you live on a farm. If you need to
right.
work in a factory, you have to work there. So there are
Sure.
only so many things
Yeah,
you can do about that.
right. Okay, we cleared that up. Good, thank you.
Mhm.
All right, our first question, Anne, she would like to know, so what's in the gut that causes, and I'm going to butcher this, the alpha-synuclein, what you were talking about, um,
Yep.
to accumulate? So
That is a great question.
mm-hmm,
And alpha-synuclein is actually a protein that just hangs out in the body. It's there naturally. We don't know what its actual purpose is. Like, we know that when it gloms up and causes a giant traffic jam, like 695, then when that happens, we know that it then goes up the axis, the glommed up version, but we actually don't know. The alpha-synuclein is in your gut, hanging out there naturally.
mm-hmm,
And it's probably a combination of genetics and these environmental exposures that causes it to then become problematic. So it goes from a normal, healthy, not problem causing alpha-synuclein to a alpha-synuclein that then causes problems. It's sort of like if you're on the beltway and everything is going along great, that's how alpha-synuclein normally is. And then
mm-hmm.
when there's, construction and a traffic accident, all of a sudden it's blocked up and you can't go anywhere. And that's like the glommed up alpha-synuclein. But we don't know what alpha-synuclein is supposed to do when it's not causing problems. But presumably it does something that we need, but we actually don't even know what it does, what it's supposed to do.
Is it everywhere in the body or just the gut and the nose?
So it's the alpha-synuclein, we can actually find it when someone has Parkinson's disease. We can find it all over the body. So we can
Oh, you
find it in
can.
the skin. If you have Parkinson's disease, we
Mm-hmm.
can find it in the skin. We can find it in the saliva. We can find it everywhere in the body, actually.
Wow.
If you have Parkinson's disease, the if you don't have Parkinson's disease, then you can't find it in all those places. It's probably then just hanging out in your gut and a few other places if you don't have Parkinson's. If you do have Parkinson's, you can actually find it everywhere.
So is that one of the ways to, when they're trying to find the diagnose for someone? Because you mentioned it starts off, and we have a question here from Sue, where one of the first symptoms is the tremors in your hands. So would this be another test you would do right away? Or because the tremors in your hands could be several things, right?
Tremors in your hands can be several things. And so actually the tremors in the earlier symptoms of Parkinson's tend to be things that are really common and do not mean you're going to develop Parkinson's. So things like constipation, things like a decreased sense of smell, which happened to a lot of people during COVID and has
Mm-hmm.
nothing to do with Parkinson's. So those are actually the earliest symptoms of Parkinson's, but those are really non-specific. A lot of people have constipation. A lot of people have a decreased sense of smell, but we think that in people who then go on to develop Parkinson's, we think the reason they have the constipation so early is because that bad alpha-synuclein is in the gut causing problems. And then working its way up to the spinal cord and what we call the midbrain and causing the constipation of the problems. And so the tremor is one of the first things that people notice when they have Parkinson's, because it's a really obvious thing,
Mm-hmm.
and it often leads them to go to the doctor. But there's actually a lot of symptoms that came before that are really non-specific. And if you have constipation and a decreased sense of smell, don't worry. But those are really non-specific. It comes even earlier. But the
Right.
tremor, if your hand is shaking, there can be lots of causes and lots of reasons for that. So it doesn't necessarily mean Parkinson's.
Right. So in other words, don't quite panic if you have that, go see your doctor and then they'll rule out, because there's lots of, I'm sure, other neurological things that could be.
Absolutely. There's lots of reasons someone's hand could be shaking. And it's also important to note that about 25% of people with Parkinson's actually don't have a tremor.
Mm-hmm.
So while most of the people with Parkinson's do, and it's a really, if it happens to people, they understandably notice it, and it tends to bring them to the doctor right away. There's about 25% of people with Parkinson's that don't even have the tremor.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So Dr. Rosenthal, Karen would like to know, so are you saying that Parkinson's disease is caused by pesticides, or is this just an idea?
So if you look at basic science data, and if you look at epidemiologic data, sort of where you look at populations as a whole, pesticides are a primary contributor to developing Parkinson's. So I think cause is probably reasonable. I can tell you with certainty that Dr. Dorsey would say yes, emphatically caused by Parkinson's disease. And I think the data is pretty good for that. But what I would hope that you would also to add to that is that the story is a little more nuanced. So yes, pesticides are causing it. In addition, there are these both positive and negative factors like genetics and exercise and diet that you can use to modify that risk. So while pesticides may be a cause, exposure to pesticides doesn't mean you're definitely going to get Parkinson's disease.
Right.
So I think the answer would be yes, but keep in mind the nuances of the answer.
Mm-hmm. So what about the difference, maybe eating organic food? Because you hear a lot about in the news too that, well, it sounds good about organic food, but they still do put pesticides on organic foods, correct? And
That is my understanding as
yeah,
well.
yeah,
And here's where I think this idea of being sort of chemical free kind of goes up against reality for most people.
right.
Organic fruit is significantly more expensive.
Mm-hmm.
And so now are we actually telling people they need to eat organic? I don't think so.
Right.
I don't buy organic fruit, whatever that's worth. I wash my fruit before I eat it. Most of the time. Occasionally I'll grab a grape without washing it. But most of the time I wash my fruit before eating it.
That's
Um,
that one cookie thing.
yes, exactly. It's the
Yeah.
one cookie concept.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so, I wash my fruit before eating it. I don't buy organic. And I think the challenge is I wouldn't assume that buying organic is actually going to mean that you don't have any pesticide exposure. So you're spending all this additional money, which some people in our lives and in our world are able to spend. And there's a whole large segment of the population that fundamentally can't afford to buy organic. And I'm not
Right.
even convinced it's going to be the benefit that you want it to be. So I wouldn't necessarily assume that. I think I would buy what makes sense for you and just be sure to wash your fruits and vegetables. But again, think back to the cookie analogy as you walk past and grab that grape and it's okay.
Right. And if we're talking about that you think that, the gut is one of the main areas, goes back to then, maybe back to that Mediterranean diet you were talking about, and just really trying to, as far as food wise, I'm talking about, really try to eat, healthy and be diligent about that. As
Exactly.
opposed to driving yourself crazy over, I have to eat everything organically.
You have summed it up perfectly, and that is exactly the
Yeah.
kind of message I don't want people to take away from this, that they need to like buy organic and live off, and live far away from everyone else and no air pollution and no pesticides and no nothing. Because that place doesn't exist in our world.
Basically, we're in a bubble. Yeah.
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 And so don't do that to yourself. Instead, live in our world and do what you can to mitigate your risk.
So thank you for all of that. Lisa wants to know, what's the difference between PSP and Parkinson's?
So great question. So the couple differences. At the
Yes.
very beginning, I talked about the tremor, the rigidity, the slowness, and the balance changes. And I didn't delve into this, but what those things actually are, if you have two of those four things, you have something called Parkinsonism. And people who have Parkinsonism, 75% of them have Parkinson's disease because there's slightly more to the diagnosis than just those things. And the other 25% of people with Parkinsonism have what we call the atypical Parkinson syndromes, or they have Parkinsonism from other causes. You can have Parkinsonism from some medications. You can have Parkinsonism from stroke. And then you can also have Parkinsonism from a whole long list of other diseases, one of which is that disease called PSP, or progressive supranuclear palsy. So that would be considered an atypical Parkinson's. One of the things that's very clear in separating out Parkinson's disease from PSP is that PSP is actually a different bad protein. So it's not the alpha-synuclein bad protein. It's a bad protein called tau. So that's a clear difference between the two. In practice, the diagnosis between Parkinson's disease and PSP is still right now, for the most part, a clinical diagnosis, and the symptoms overlap considerably, but not perfectly. And so we kind of get into the weeds about the differences between the two of them. And there are some differences. PSP progresses faster than Parkinson's disease, and PSP has a number of other features that separate it out from Parkinson's disease. And again, it's also a different protein.
Great, thank you. So it looks like we have time for about maybe one more question, 1.5. Lucy wants to know, so why does Parkinson's disease progress faster in some than in others? You know, what, besides the genetic part of it, is there anything else? And the obvious that you mentioned, the activity and all of that.
So we know there are some genes that are very clearly associated with faster and slow progression. So people who have some specific genes progress faster than people with other specific genes. We know that. And we know that people who exercise progress slower than those who don't. People who generally have fewer other health issues progress slower than those who don't. But fundamentally, we don't always know why people progress faster than others. I mean, it's a combination of genes and environmental factors, which is kind of the thesis of this entire talk, but I can't speak to, because we don't know, why is it this individual is progressing faster compared to this other individual, other than a few specific genes that I can speak to. But otherwise, we don't always know. But we know that globally, genetic factors, environmental factors, and a combination of those two are why some people progress faster than others.
Thank you for that. And then quickly, is Parkinson's disease more prevalent in women of color or not? And is there men and women? I mean, is there anything out there that scientifically that has this research?
So generally, it's about 60-40 men, women. So in terms of gender, it's about 60-40 men, women. The latest numbers that I saw are about 20% of people in the United States are who have Parkinson's disease are underrepresented minorities and people of color. So generally less in that population compared to Caucasian. However, there are a number of factors that go into counting these up that we don't really know. So there are genetic factors, there are environmental factors, and then there's also just access to care factors. Because a lot of times when we look at these numbers, populations that historically have less access to healthcare may or may not be accurately counted amongst these numbers. So while the 20% number is what we are saying right now, I don't think we have a really as good idea as we should about the sort of racial and ethnic representation of Parkinson's disease. And there's been a number of large push in the Parkinson's research community to try and address some of those disparities. And it is a slow process. I do
Mhm.
think we're doing a little bit better in that regard, but
Yeah,
we have a long way to go.
right. Well, thank you very much. It looks like we're at the 8 o'clock hour, so I want to thank Dr. Rosenthal for speaking with us tonight. She has graciously agreed to respond to any of the unanswered questions that were asked this evening. So in a couple of weeks, you'll receive an email with answers to any of the outstanding questions, which is wonderful. A video of tonight's live stream will be available on the A Woman's Journey website, hopkinsmedicine.org/A Woman's Journey under Videos on Demand. Thank you to everyone who has joined us for any of our 2024 webinars. We look forward to having you be part of our 2025 webinar series. Between now and our first webinar in the new year, scheduled for January 14th, I invite you to check out our website, hopkinsmedicine.org/A Woman's Journey, for recordings of past webinars you may have missed, as well as the list of webinars for the new year. Have a wonderful holiday season, and I look forward to being with all of you for our next webinar in January. Good night and stay well.